So, I'm so excited to have Lisa and Heather here today, too. Two wonderful artists and culture makers of many kinds who I really admire and really respect, and turns out have been friends for 20 years, which I didn't know when I invited them both, which is extra awesome. We spoke briefly before this and decided that today we would present on some very brief ideas and then have a conversation. And if you're interested in sort of the breadth of our practices, you can Google them. So I want to talk about a paradigm of success, which is totally linked with failure. And you know, my parents were a little bit MoMA or bust, right? Like, it was the 70s and 80s, and Dad spoke about this when he spoke at the, you know, after the museum opening, talking, you know, in his book, that it was like, get reviewed at the Times, get a gallery, get a show at MoMA. Good luck. And that paradigm of success caused a lot of grief, because it is a pretty unattainable goal, right? I mean, most of the people who have that goal are not going to get it. The biggest New York Times article that Mom has ever gotten was her obituary. Success? Failure? Both? I don't know. I'm, you know, I'm on the fence there. Allison talked about The Well. It was a piece installed in, was Randall's Island, I think, and it's now in storage. We'd like to recast it at some point, but an incredible moment for me was seeing this photograph, which was shared by a colleague. Oh, no, not this one. A photograph by Arthur Tress of a man in the well. And this was an amazing moment of success for me, because it was really joyful. I know that Mom would have loved this photo and thought it was sexy and funny and, you know, moving. And that idea of sculpture becoming something else when it is in public space is important. So, you know, what is a paradigm of success that I can live with? It's one of the reasons that I founded the Wassaic project, though I'm not sure I realized it at the time. This is that sculpture after a tree fell on it. I think it's still pretty beautiful, and happily was restored because there was great insurance at Lehigh University. Thank you for that, institutionally. And there it is cited. What is success? What makes us feel good as culture makers, as musicians, as artists, as makers, as curators? What are the thresholds that we totally make ourselves to pass through to feel joy and to feel accomplishment and success? You know, having this show at WICMA is an incredible success, and it was like exhausting, and I wasn't even curating it or making it or coordinating anything. You know, so it was also this like sense of potential and loss and fruition and all of these things at once. You know, we're here at this symposium. This is a huge success. You know, all 27 of us, right? And there will be successes from this day in the future because of the material that has been made here. That's my 3-minute alarm. So just super briefly, you know, we experience success also with failure. And in my own work and its materiality, there's lots of success and then lots of very funny failure. I'm pointing to a misprint on a blanket. Luckily, that was only on one blanket of, you know, I need this rushed, please. It was so funny, and my sister's like, that's the one I want. I don't want any of the other ones. That's the one I want. So a failure became a success. You know, I am exploding things all the time. disaster, total disaster. Without failure, I can't learn, right? So failure is critical to success. You know, as I make prints, sometimes the failures alongside the successes are the piece. Oh, what? What a surprise. You know, this building that the Wassaic project is in, it falling down and being renovated is what gave space to what it is now. And, you know, the sort of weird, wacky events that we're able to do and the things in our community that we can focus on. So, success is people coming up, you know, coming out to the firehouse to vote. Success is, you know, a giant installation and projection by Christy Chan. Success is like a super wackadoodle, you know, full-on 8,000 square foot haunted house every year made by artists. And success is also still the Times, and also still MoMA, and also still museum shows, and also still gallery shows. Learning to live with all of these together, I think is my work for myself now. And now I will invite up Lisa.
Thank you, Eve. I wish I could say that I had a good timer. Now I'm feeling pressure to put on some good music, but I'm going to try to keep to the time. I love that, this idea of failure, the idea of spaces for us to learn and continually learn. When we spoke about how we were going to come together today, I'm really drawn to the familial connection between Mary Ann and Eve, particularly because I work with my family members, and also because I think of myself and my role in relationality as a family member all the time. This is a piece that I make with my family members, and it's the materials, a sort of issue that has come up today, and saying, I'm so glad to be here and to have witnessed the conversations in the morning and afternoon that previous to this one, talking about materiality and the metaphors, the processes that can really further meaning. In that sense, this comes up for my family members, my collaborators all the time, in terms of what kind of materials can we use, what kind of charge can they have, and how might we use a material like a cane from our father in a sculpture, and to rethink it as a moment of structure and connectivity. How might we think of these family dinner trays, which may have surfaced in our family life and make us think of our late father in a very particular way, but how might we change that meaning when it's stacked together or associated with other ephemera that we're cleaning out the house with? So how materials can change meaning based on proximity and technique. We think about this in forms of textiles, where we'll take used textiles, or we'll take apart things, we'll use store-bought fabrics and fibers, and then we'll naturally dye fibers with particular materials, so that in their literal weaving together, we can weave new stories. And by their proximity and image and the different processes and techniques that my family and my family members and I, we bring together, they can tell these new kind of stories. Whether it's one about reproduction, whether it's stories about how we interact with our bodies and as family members, or how we interact with artworks. Some of these materials I've thought a lot about what happens to these sculptures, what happens to these artworks out in the world when a tree falls on them, or when a natural process, other natural processes, or just even time takes its core. I love kind of being gravitated towards materials that are not meant to hold space for too long, whether it's a type of air-dry clay that my son is invited to create, that we hide behind paintings that then can be activated by the viewer in their hinge and the sort of cheeky quality of that, or whether it's like a repurposing of certain armatures so that we can drape textiles that we make together so that we can see them from different viewpoints. So using materials to have new vantage points and new perspectives, and how to reignite and refashion things, how to take moments of grieving and mourning and how to refashion them. So when I was in the Dominican Republic, where my father was from, the home where he grew up in was, our family members were dying, and there was no one to sort of inherit these objects, and how one passes objects to another is very much on our mind. The two objects that our mother had from her family was a braid of hair and a mate, or a woven fabric that I showed earlier on. And in this case, these were works like vinyl records and their sleeves that were going to transition from their house with no one to inherit them, and how to really think about them in new kind of ways. How I might stack them to think about strata and layers, and how a certain viewpoint will give an idea of an illusion of stacking, while other viewpoints will talk about the separation between things. So these series of capas, or strata and layers, I focused that on this show in the Dominican Republic, where I took objects from the immediacy of the environment around the gallery, and from my family home, to kind of make new grammatical connections or little vignettes. And sometimes that happens by taking disparate materials, and sometimes that can happen by taking one material totally apart and casing it to make something new. In this case, Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, taking it apart and casting it into these blocks that can be given away for free. This idea of longevity and the lifetime of a sculpture is often on my mind and the mind of my collaborators. In pieces even like this, whether I'm collaborating with a family member or with a gallery viewer, the idea of creating a sculpture or a wall drawing together, and what happens to that material is fascinating to me. It's surprising. You can then become a viewer of your own work because you can have a certain idea of how someone might finish a sentence, but then the viewer, by activating it and how it's considered, will totally change the context and then create new opportunities for meaning, such as when a participant, like this is my kid Bowie, becomes then part of the artwork, both in that very moment when his literal body is incorporated, or whether it's his handwriting that leaves the trace. So much ripe stuff that we're talking about, and I think that constellation of how things are woven together is super exciting. I'm so happy to invite our friend Heather to the stage now to also talk about sculpture and the expanded field, and our materiality. Thank you.
So hi. So I was going to talk a little bit about failure, but I kept rationalizing it into successes. And I think that is actually reality for me in a way, where they're kind of indistinguishable from each other. There's, of course, rejection in being an artist. I think making applications 40 times in a year and getting one win, one grant is very common. But I also think that there's no way to actually move forward in a sculpture career without experimentation and progress. And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the things I mentioned yesterday. This is one of the rooftops that I made, and in the interior, the more intimate part of the participatory roof, the hearth was made of squawks style drums that you could play. And so, I built them out with a method that I learned from a friend who is gifted with squawks and song and drum making. And I mounted them into this wall with openings so that they would resonate, and put them together kind of like a Mondrian painting, let's say, my concepts and methods were tight. I was excited. And then I realized we were in Seattle, where it rains all the time. And if you know, like rawhide, it softens with moisture. And so this is one of those times where you just have to kind of go with the flow and figure out what the work is about, maybe not before you make it. So one of the things I think that I realized here is that, as I mentioned yesterday, a lot of my work is about process, and it's about this interaction between people. It's about this desire to be engaged with this space and this effort. So for me, it wasn't necessarily about the failure of a piece. It was about that desire to resonate someone's audible prayer out into the Seattle skyline. This is another piece, another rooftop piece. This one, speaking of moisture, we started building this and realized that, North Carolina was having unprecedented rains, global warming, and the ground cover was being washed out on a pretty regular basis, and so we had to do some problem solving. And one of those solves was actually building out the interior in a way that I hadn't done before. But like I mentioned before, collaboration, brainstorming with fabricators and thinking about what is vernacular in that area architecturally, built out a deck and some corn crib siding so that the washout could run underneath the roof and out the other side. I'm just going to run through quickly. These are some of the activations that I hosted on the roof. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk through a little bit was that new research that I'm doing with black space, quote unquote. Thinking about the Lorraine Motel railing that Martin Luther King was assassinated behind, and thinking about what it would look like in a white box gallery space. So I made sketches, and I made models, and then I made the thing. And one of the things that I didn't actually realize until making it full scale was that there was some sort of resonance that happened when somebody stood in this corner where Dr. King is dying in all of the photographs. There were different levels of association that people drew to the actual space itself, but I had a real aversion with people actually engaging in that corner, actually like staying there for any length of time. And that's something that I would never, ever have guessed. I mean, it's a sculpture that I made. If anything, it maybe should be problematic that I recreated a traumatic site like this, right? But it was a spot for connection and communication. So briefly, I also wanted to talk about, this push and pull I've had a long time over space versus object, maybe versus place too. So I first, one of the black spaces that I created, I printed in 3D, and it was Uhura's workstation, right? So I put the little painting on there so that you could tell what it was, and then I was like, this is definitely not it, because this is an illustration, and I'm a sculptor, and this is not what my work looks like. And so I was like, okay, remove the paint. It just needs to be minimal so we can think about form. But it was an illustration still because the whole form was there, and I needed something that was maybe a little more abstracted. And so I've been kind of pushing and pulling with this idea of abstraction and access over the last 2 years, and the idea of how meaning can form when sculpture is in association with each other and installed in different places. or maybe has a home of its own in association with one other object, in communication with one other object. And so I think that for me, these idea of failure is a process and it's experimentation, and it's something that I teach my students to embrace. And I'm looking forward to talking with you too. Also, I brought my great-grandfather's self-published book, which is a kind of failure in a weird way, where, this probably only existed a few copies, but yeah, success, legacy, failure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the image behind us is a success and a failure. When we spoke, we sort of almost simultaneously had this idea of well, how about a diagram of all these ideas that we're talking about? And of course, it became a drawing and is hopelessly incomplete. I mean, as soon as I was yeah, this is fine, it's fine. And then I was wait, everything should be connected to itself, and it's missing 1,000 ideas. And it's, it just is what it is. It's a start. So that's our visual context for our conversation. So this is sort of about stuff and things and why we make with what we make. And I kind of wanted to, what resonated from our first conversation, and I wanted to start this conversation with, was what is the thing and what is the stuff? So, Lisa was talking about family connections in the material and in the making and in the collaborating, and the thing are these objects, maybe, and the viewpoints is a thing that you have made. And Heather, you've talked about the activations being part of the work, and is the moment the thing, and the materials being wood, but also why wood being part of the materials. And I thought we could start with that. What's the stuff and what's the things?
Yeah, and which comes first, or and that all things, or all the objects, or all the materials, that the activation is plastic, that all of it can be interchangeable. Yeah, I was very drawn to these relationships, how do we choose what we're going to focus on? And when I think of Eve and Heather, I think of their lineage and their family members as something that can't be tethered away from them as individuals. I think that's I think of us as relational, just as a natural matter of course. And so when I see those materials that you're working with, it makes me think of all those relationships that you have, whether it's as a family member, as a maker, and whether the material predates the idea, or if the material is do we choose it because we have is it object first? But I think that can also shift. How does it work for you, Heather, when you're thinking about what to make? Is it kind of the spatial or the object orientation and then the material follows, or how do you feel about it?
I mean, for me, it's maybe a little of both, but I think for me, I'm always thinking about that wood has been something that has been bequeathed to me, and it's a living thing. It has a mind of its own to a certain extent, and it is, it's got a lifespan to a certain extent. Nothing is really that permanent. And so that has been something that I've come back to and tried to rethink a lot. I think when I started doing 3D prints, I had an existential crisis because it wasn't something that I was touching with my hands in the same way, and it didn't feel connected to my lineage in the same way. So yeah, I started making containers for them so that my lineage could hold that new media in a way. So I think for me, it is pretty tethered to material. it feels like something that I can like re-perform, that has been performed and taught to me earlier. Yeah.
How critical in your thinking about the presentations of your work is it for someone experiencing an oracle to know that? And how do you think about communicating that history and context?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to make things that have, you know, onion layers, I guess, or like maybe there's something tastier that has layers, but where, you know, you can have a valid and like really rich experience without knowing anything. And then you can come back and maybe you're like, oh, but this. And then you can come back and you're like, maybe more. And then you can have a conversation with me and there's maybe even more. And then you can read something, there's more. And there's just like a space that keeps giving in a way, or at least keeps catalyzing, you know, depending on who you're experiencing it with, what just happened to you that day, what you have just read. And I think that happens with all art, but I just want to kind of like, the reason that I do the work that I do is because I feel like it amplifies that more than what I had been doing in my previous lives. So I don't think it matters at all that they know the inception of all of my choices. But I hope that it kind of resonates and echoes and gets thrown around a bit. And, you know, already over the last 2 days, I've heard people, you know, pick up on things and subliminal messages that I've had in my work. So I like how it can stretch in meaning, and that like one person can have one reading and another person can understand it in a different way.
I'm curious to hear your take on that same idea, especially having seen the work, which I had not seen before, using the material of your family from the DR, and some of which were visually abstracted.
Yeah, how things change. I was when Heather, when you were speaking, I was thinking about this idea, like simultaneity of entry points. That there's a lot of ways to enter, a lot of windows and frames with which to understand the work, and how that work can shift both metaphorically and idea-wise, and also its physicalness can change, whether it's like because of the natural elements and it's super humid, or depending on how you place an element. Like I was thinking about the ceramic sculptures that you're making and how they will change their meaning depending on where they go. When you just brought up that show, I thought of, and one of the things that I didn't mention was that because I don't live in the Dominican Republic and I don't have a way to bring that work back, everything from that show stayed, and all of the parts got dispersed to art students at the nearby art school, that they could come to the show and then take it all apart. So some of those objects became books that students chose to read, and then other parts, whether it was a plate of glass or a ring of concrete, might have become part of other sculptures. So how these things, whether it's like a huge sculpture that's taken apart or something that then explodes in the kiln, it has that timeline, and that they can return to this idea of becoming materials, and they have that lifeline that we're talking about, that especially maybe sculpture can have. Yeah.
And I love that it's not static. You know what I mean? Like, it's so difficult to be dealing with a history of sculpture where, you know, we're talking about these big marble figurative things that are never going to change. When you really want it to have, like, I guess, cultural value as it ages in a way, or, you know, continue to create, like, inspire conversation in different contexts. And so I feel like the only way to do that is for something that is not static in some way.
Do we want to talk more about permanence? This amazing question that Terrence offered earlier. I mean, that sort of, you know, dissemination, disintegration, destruction, new life to those materials that you were just speaking about. And our conversation last night around
Yeah.
future installations, and that might be, I don't know, whatever your call. But I am curious about permanence, because there are some really valuable things about changeability and malleability and responsiveness, and some terrible things about permanence, and vice versa.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe I feel like I'm just right in there, like with a tug of war between the two things. Thinking about what might have happened if my dad had stayed here, or if my grandfather's book was not self-published, if it was a big publishing house, or if I do have like a roof of bronze or something. Like what what is the difference? Last night we were talking about legacy and what is the plan? Is there a plan? Might there be a plan? Could there be something creative that outlasts us, especially in the ways that we work?
What happens to the materials of your oracles after the exhibition life?
I mean, most of the time they're donated like the same way. Like, I might keep, like I kept the hearth of the roof I talked about yesterday, but all of the like lumber and usable material gets donated to like Habitat for Humanity or local colleges. Like the one in Queens went to a skate park. So yeah, I mean, it's also about capitalism in a way. We're in a society where it's much cheaper to rebuild something like that I make than it is to store it. I don't work in barns,
Right, there's like that utilitarian aspect of it. And also then I think it involves a criticality of capitalism as well, not privileging and amplifying the product and fetishizing this thing to save forever. And at the same time, right, there's a tension there, because it is important to create legacy and to take care of objects as well. So, right, I think you put that really well. It's this tug of war, this tension. And earlier today, I think that word dynamic came up. I think that's a really beautiful word. And when we're thinking about sculpture and materiality, and whether or not you want to engage and dance with and acknowledge a dynamic quality, or try to tame it, or how do we collaborate with that? I don't know. I don't know. There's definitely not one way, but it's an endless source, maybe, of ideas and failures and try-agains. So in that sense, it's like an everlasting fertile zone for inquiry.
Experimentation.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I want to experiment with, or that I have been talking about doing, is, that's maybe my version of a Solowit build plan. What happens if the pieces can be like rebuilt? I mean, and that's what's happened in negotiations of sales to institutions, where it's like they can't keep something on site that is like, they can't like take it off site into storage, because mine is site specific. It's like anchored into the ground. So if there goes into disrepair, or if they have to deinstall it somehow, they have like a license and a very detailed build plan on how to reinstall it. But again, it's different. It's different than that fetishized object, and like, where is that threshold? And I think that's kind of what I'm thinking about with those black space 3D prints too. It's like, what are these things? What is the association? What is my like authorship around it, I guess?
How did you feel, Eve, about the translation between your drawings and then the fabricated textile? I also agree that was it's like it becomes this other humorous object, but also did the idea shift when it changed from however you first made it, whether it was a pen on paper or a digital drawing, and then how it translated into a factory like jacquard weaving?
Every step in a process transforms a piece, and I'm a printmaker, and I've started making prints of my sculptures. So there's, a sort of an interaction with the end result, And then there's this sort of ridiculous story of like, I made this thing with my hands, and then I fired it, then I glazed it, then I fired it again, then I took an iPhone photo of it, and then I put it on my computer, and then I changed it, and then I printed it out, then I printed it on a piece of fabric, and then I hung it on the wall. And in a certain way, all of that is like irrelevant to your experience of it, like when you see it. But it's also about this sort of transformation that is not fully in my control, which is a kind of interesting segue into my next question, which is there is a shaping of physical space, and then there's also a shaping of experiential space. And the oracles are interactive. I was thinking about blank must start now, must stop now, make America, abre la puerta again. And, there's a way in which, and of course, the Wassaic project and the sort of social practice that goes into that and shaping someone's experience, right? And everybody who has worked on the symposium of like shaping experience, what comes next, who introduces, the sort of, how do you make someone comfortable in the psychological space, I guess, experiential space might be better. And I'm curious, about we heard about some last night, some unexpected successes through that, and the kind of visual cues that we can offer to shape experiential space. And I'd be curious to hear more about that. And what was the timing on disassembling that show in the DR, and what was the experience of that, and the creation of joy that you're making with the programming around the oracles. What is your approach to shaping that experiential space?
Yeah, I think it's for me, it's about always engaging with that uncertainty and feeling comfortable with being uncertain and inviting an entropy, because you can set a course of parameters and then you never know what's going to happen. I can put out, silk-screened posters, and then actually what's reflected from the community is not necessarily a progressive-minded response, but maybe a highly conservative and limiting one. So, which then gives me new information. So, it creates new information and creates more questions, which is always really interesting. And then, just create space for new ideas. When you spoke about this question, the first project I thought of was a project I'd made with my sister, Janelle Iglesias, as Las Hermanas Iglesias, and the piece is Everybody Likes to Dance, where we created this mashup between merengue and pulse, which is a Norwegian dance, very much like the polka. And this new choreography was painted on the floor, and we sort of assumed that people would follow the dance diagram, and it was so much better than that. People made their own dances and used the cues of the dance diagram to create their own rules and bring it back to this instructional idea, or how we might collaborate with viewers, participants, however we might want to use that language, and how the work gets activated in different ways we can't imagine. There's a charge and a spark and a surprise in that is so juicy, and I think it's that I'm drawn to that, but also terrified of it, and therefore also drawn again.
I think my system maybe is really to access universals through specifics. So I keep saying this, but I don't feel like I'm the generous one in my situation. I very much think of my practice as a studio practice. It's like I am learning and growing and experimenting and playing with my own ideas, and it intersects with the public. But I guess maybe this relates to what we talked about earlier at lunch, is like I always have my own stakes in mind. I always have, like, that's the only way for me that it's sustainable. This is the only way that I'm going to continue the work and continue, I guess, having it feel relevant to anyone else too, because it's relevant to me. So I guess when I approach like finding this kind of interaction and parameters around them, it's just like I have to make sure that it's relevant for me first. I don't know.
In listening to you speak about this and speaking about your work last night, it really feels like the oracles are creating spaces. You have created space for joy with the oracles.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's like the joy and the space is already there. I'd like it to be an amplifier.
Maybe the couch is an amplifier too. I think they're related in an interesting way. And to hold that is pretty awesome. Will you tell us about how the distribution at the end of that show went? I'm really curious.
Yeah. Sorry, I just did not pay attention to that part of the question. I was not there for it because the show happened during a sort of a residency that I had in La Romana, and my family and I left while the show was still up. So the dissemination was a list of requests and invitations, and I don't know what it was like. I invited the instructors and their students to come on when it went on the day that it was done, or rather, actually, the day it was still open. So it wasn't even the day it was done would have been afterwards. That it was sort of part of the show. During the open hours, students were invited to come and just take things apart. And so I wish I could have been there, but it's sort of an imagined. I only have an imagined idea of what it looked like or felt like for the sculptures to kind of disappear or dwindle or be taken apart and then be taken away by hand or by cart. So I don't really know, but and that's also interesting. It's very much like I think of it like kind of like a takeaway poster, where sometimes we'll use a takeaway poster as this plinth or a pedestal, and many times whoever sees it is invited to take one. And then so that again, like there's that dynamic life of the sculpture, and it can live and then get smaller. And I think of it sort of like the dissemination of that show, that they lived and they had their certain kind of experience, and then in a generative way they turned into something else, and people took from it what they needed or wanted, which was also an interesting relationship. And then it enabled like that a connection between those people who I'd spent time with at the residency.
Thanks. Would you be open to telling us about the book that's in your lap?
Yeah, of course. So this is one of those things where I think I must have heard about when I was young from my father, but again, you have these kind of slippages between what somebody says and then what you actually hear and retell. So I think it was really only when I was on that research trip and came to the Williamstown Historical Museum that I found that a draft of this, and then told my dad, and he's like, oh yeah, I have that in the bookshelf. And I'm like, what? And so I bought every copy that I could, but now it's like $2,000, so I can't buy any more copies. But yeah, it's my great-grandfather's favorite recipes. I know you can't see from very far away, but it has a picture of him, and it's training tables. It weighs in all of the sports teams at Williams College from the beginning of the year, tells you what they ate because my great-grandfather, I guess, told them what to eat, and then weighs them out. And it has like theories of nutrition, and some recipe samples, stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I worked with this as material for a long time too, but it's also, I think, just like an interesting, like, I guess I can speculate like what he wanted from this, versus what it is now, and also possibilities, Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I mean, I'm kind of curious. Can I ask a question? I don't want to jump ahead, but I want to know with both of you guys, because I feel this way sometimes. We all have these like individual practices, and then these kind of like collaborative practices, and like how do you navigate that space, especially as a woman? It's like I feel like sometimes I feel like I look at peers who are like, it's very easy to just like live in autonomy while also collaborating or something. And I have a lot of difficulty navigating that space, I think, where it's like, sacrificing certain things or somebody approaches you for the collaborative and you want to talk about your practice or vice versa. Yeah, I don't know.
I've collaborated a lot, and now I'm collaborating with various fabricators, not for the first time, but much more in the past year. Thank you, Lauren Smith, out there. I think that I had an emotional journey with collaboration. I feel very powerful in collaborations and able to, especially in artistic collaborations, in that I feel able to pitch them, right? When I was making collaborative objects with Bowie, starting in 2007, calling up a space and being like, my collaborator and I are, whatever. It was much easier than saying like, I have made this thing. I deserve this space. Give this to me, please. I mean, I don't even know if I could have done it, even with the please, right? So there was this like confidence. It's like, okay, well, you're really smart. Like, I guess you think I'm smart. Well, we both think this is good. Okay, maybe it's a good idea. There was this bolstering, and I collaborated with Bowie making objects, with Alon and Jeff and Bowie founding the Wassaic project, with Bowie and Jeff running the Wassaic project, with my husband Josh making public murals for 10 years. And when I had kids, when Josh and I had kids, I really was looking for collaboration, and Josh was working on the opera and working on other things and didn't have space. Bowie was interested in the Wassaic project as her practice and was not interested in making objects anymore. And I was really lost until I was so free. And then I was like, I can make whatever the fuck I want. No one's gonna tell me like, oh, change it. And that was amazing. I mean, I'm still working in collaboration like intensely every day. It's my job is a radical collaboration with hundreds of different artists making the Wassaic project. And I'm so grateful for all of that. And working in collaboration with Allison and with my dad and, with the spirit of my mom. And I think that there's a way in which coming out of that kind of devastation of not having my collaborators and moving into this space of freedom and confidence in my own work and choices that gave me this space to sort of unsilo everything. I'm sure Allison remembers sort of at early days when I was working with the estate and we started to co-host visits together after Allison had been hosting them heroically for years. We only talked about mom. And I was like, wow, these curators are leaving and they don't even know Wassaic exists. This is heartbreaking. And I was like, oh, who can fix this? I can fix this. Let's just change the approach. And there was this just melting of walls, and the emotional experience at the beginning of Wassaic when there were 4 founders and when one of us would get left out of an article, it was devastating and well, didn't you say this? And just now I'm I don't care. It's all mine, right? Not in a like not crediting other people, but in a like, I have put this out in the world and I am attached to it no matter what. Whether you know who I am or not. Whether you know how I was attached to it or what I wrote, it doesn't matter. I'm working to hold on to that feeling. I don't know if I'll be able to, but that's the goal.
Yeah, the individual and the collaborative. The collaboration with my sister started around in 2005, and we didn't go to art school per se, and we were really green and kind of, as we like to call ourselves, like late bloomers, and it was a source of support and camaraderie and advocacy for each other that sort of grew it, and then all of the complications and challenges with working with another person kept it fresh and then philosophically and politically grounded it. That through, it was all about then that conflict, and that's why we should continue. And working with our mom then it really then bolstered it. It became even renewed and more important, and it became this sort of love letter to her, and we had renewed access to her as a human in a really different way. And so that's really important. And at different points when we have conversations with curators and different folks, and people want to tease apart who does what, and your website is confusing because I can't tell, like, it's too much. And exactly, it's just like, we're just jumping into the mess, and we're just letting it be messy, and letting it be aligned with our life and our experiences as parents and caregivers and friends and partners and all of that, and trying not to silo it, I think, is increasingly there, and trying to maintain an individual autonomy and presence as well, and trying to like do that just messily, and that we're going to step on each other's toes and feel shrouded, and just come back to the table again and talk about it. So yeah, I'm tending to just it's all tethered together, and it can't be separated, and trying to push it all together. And I think at the end of the day, trying to think of time differently than maybe I sometimes feel pressured to do, which is on a very linear, fast-paced, sometimes semester-driven, because I'm also teaching. So like that timeline, I'm just trying to ignore and see, okay, this can happen in a very kind of rhizomatic, flexible way, and I don't have to obey time the way I'm feeling pressured to. And if I think about time in a different way, then maybe I can think of myself as an individual and as a collaborator also, as an expansive way also, that it maybe doesn't happen all at the same moment, but that stepped away from, and with a larger perspective, it was always there anyway. I don't know. It's messy. How about you, Heather?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's been harder for me to blur the boundaries. I mean, obviously, a lot of my collaborations blurred boundaries, absolutely. But Black Lunch Table, I think, because there's so much, it is so much, and the material of Black Lunch Table is so different than the rest of my practice. And I feel like I have a responsibility to other people when I start talking about Black Lunch Table, that I've needed to draw boundaries, I guess. So maybe the opposite of what you guys are talking about. But it's been really hard because it's so easy to talk about Black Lunch Table for me, And so, and I can picture it anywhere, I can picture it, like that's the first thing that I will pitch in a space easily, because I just feel like, the world needs it. But it's been harder for me to remind myself that the world needs my sculpture too. It's been harder for me to speak up for myself, I guess, in that way, or to stay on topic when I have a studio visit. Yeah.
The world needs your work.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's I think, the systematic, like, feminist, like, plight.
It's also harder for me to pitch my own work.
There's so many words up there.
Yeah, well, actually, Lauren was a bit of a collaborator on this one, too. Do you guys have any more questions, or should we open this up to the expanded
I'm
field?
good.
Open it up. Let's open it up.
I have a question, which I'm so curious how, as sculptors, the question of permanence has come up and impermanence. So I hope you could talk a little bit about the necessity of documentation. So I'm just so interested that this act and practice of letting people take away, not having a pole barn to put things in, so giving it to habitat. And just what is the method then of legacy?
That is the plight of my existence. So that's definitely been a good topic around failure for me, because I've definitely learned the hard way to be like super specific and demanding about documentation. Like, the only way my work lives is through documentation most of the time. And there has been many places where I've worked with curators who it's like not really on the list of their scope, or their idea of a good photo is not my idea of a good photo, or where they've like hire event photographers who take photos of people's faces and not the work. So it's a practice, but I think I've been slowly trying to work it into like a letter of agreement, or like create a page of like what shots I need. And if they can't fulfill it, that I'll hire my own photographer. It's just like, it's frustrating when I'm like, I'll hire my own photographer. And they're like, no, we got it. But I'm like, but actually, I don't think that you do. Yeah, there's been a couple times where I've had to, like, throughout the run of the show, go back in multiple times because they say they got it and they don't got it. And then they say they'll correct it and then they don't correct it. And I've never felt so OCD. But it's like, it really is. It's the only, I have like archival images that don't work, that I can't include in slideshows because they don't show the work and they're ugly. So, but I don't do video ever.
That was great advice. It's also, for me, it's a work in progress as well, figuring out the different ways that one might document, whether it's video or photography or writing, and seeking multiple perspectives about it. So I think that's really smart advice about entering it into the letter of agreement, which I don't know that I've necessarily privileged that enough in the past. Because also all these contexts are different, right? Whether you're all of the spaces and organizations that you're working with have certain kinds of resources and access. So yeah, bringing that into the conversation at the very least, and sharing that and making shared agreements is so important.
It seems like it would be so simple, but it's really, really complex.
We think about documentation a lot at Wassaic Project, and one of the things that I've been realizing that I really don't have, we photograph all of our residents. Jeff, as part of his photographic practice, goes in and takes portraits of all the residents in their studios, and it's this, really a project about place and influence of place, but we really don't have any record, except maybe anecdotally, about what gets made in Wassaic. And then what is, and this is like so abstract and is maybe like the rest of every artist who comes through his careers, if I'm thinking really, grabby, what gets made that is influenced by their time, right? So there's also this like, well, what was the documentation of the taking down of that show in DR and what got made with that material? And do you care? Maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, you can sort of like take that documentation too far. It's interesting that you're not doing video. Like, what about sort of visitor testimonial, right? Of like, what was the feeling? What is the record of the feeling, right? We've like made this experiential space. Like, what is the consequence of that experiential space, and what is the record of that experience? If it's, how is that expressed? Like, it sort of comes back to that question of what is the thing? Like, is the thing the photograph, the object, the video, the feeling, the memory, right? I remember experiencing your piece at the Brooklyn Museum.
And that's what I'm more interested in. So how do you like come back to somebody 5-10 years later? And be like,
I mean, I think we just do it, right? It's sort of like, it's like it's an ask for it, right? Which is centering yourself, centering myself, centering yourself in a totally fabulously narcissistic way. Tell me how I made you feel good, right? I mean, I want to hear all about that.
Tell us how we made you feel, everyone.
Yeah, that might be a good prompt for all of us. Thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Hi. I have a question about whether any of you feel when you're making your work that you're working within a frame of reference. And what I mean by that is when I think of, say, Michelangelo working within a religious frame of reference, I think there's a certain realm of symbolism that he could access that probably most of his viewers understood. And I wonder if any of you feel that you are working within an equivalent frame of reference for the people that see your work, and your relationship to the people that see your work.
Maybe you could speak to that in terms of site specificity and the kind of site research, and I'd be curious to hear from you about your parents' heritage and how that context is either known or unknown, and if it matters.
Yeah, I think that there can be these multiple frame of references, right? So all the time there are these swirling connectors, and whether that's a title that's in Spanish that maybe only a Spanish speaker will understand, and it's kind of okay that there's a set of viewers who won't be able to access that unless they look it up. That's interesting, right? Even when you were asking this question, which I think is really very interesting, I thought about the images of the knit paintings that I showed that had anatomical references, and the one that's called capital T. And I was wondering who would be able to engage with that work. And there were a few people who came up and talked about their own IUD experiences with me, which I was hoping that it would resonate with them. And then there was a whole bunch of people, it would not have made a difference, a very, very simple gesture towards an IUD in form, and using that phrase, capital T, it would not have meant, it would mean something totally different. So I really like playing with that, these codified signifiers, because just like you brought up, like this idea of the Western canon, and that there was representation and these coded languages that were there for a subset of people. We can bring in all these other layers that will speak to lots and lots of communities. And it's okay that not everyone gets it, because I think, as what you were speaking to before, Heather, that it can exist on a certain level, and it's okay if people don't get those other things, right? Or this idea that it's important to me that the work is birthed from my experiences as a Dominican Norwegian first or 1.5 generation kid, growing up in Queens. Like, some of that won't resonate with people, and some of it then really does, this idea of like a transcultural hybridity. And it's okay if not all of those those stabs land, because it will land in other ways that we can't control. Like there's the intentional connections, and then hopefully some of that lands, and there will be other things that are surprising. So that's really interesting, thinking about the multiplicity of frames of reference that we're operating with.
Multiplicity, I like that. Yeah, I feel like all of my work is so intersectional, and I think just like at its base conceptual level are conjunctios, so they exist as two opposite things at the same time. That may be my most base frame of reference that applies to everybody, I guess. I, of course, have stakes in different areas, and I talked about, Black communities, and I talk about communities of women, and I talk about communities of carpenters, and I talk about communities from the Northwest, and talk about biracial communities. And I know long ago, like Lisa and I have the Norwegian mothers in common. And so I guess my goal is, I guess, going back to what I said earlier, is just to have all of those things embedded somewhere, and let it be layers to access as you experience over time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Do any other questions? No, you were clapping. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ivana Dizdar, and this year I'm the Mary Ann Unger Estate's Curatorial Fellow. I'm fortunate to have the opportunity to think about, engage with, and sit with Unger's work as I research and write about her practice, her life, and her complex vision of the world. This has and will include visits to Unger's public art and collections housing her work, visits to exhibitions of Unger's work, including the one currently on view at the Williams College Museum of Art, thoughtfully curated by Horace Ballard. And also time in her studio/apartment space turned estate, where I've had the privilege of flipping through and reading Unger's many sketchbooks and journals. Journals where the artist details her interests and obsessions, her struggles and successes, her dreams and her fears. The journals span a range of things. They're spiritual, poetic, and philosophical. Reflections on her dreams and meditations on life and love appear throughout. They span the psychological, self-analytic, internal dialogues about how she was and how she should be. And there was the practical, how she would earn an income, when she would exercise, what she would eat. But through and through, her personal writings are also deeply engaged with the question of artistry, of art making, and what it meant for her to be an artist in her day and age. I first came to Unger's work through the photographs of Jeffrey Biddle, and product placement. The Williams College Museum of Art has a notebook with this image on it in the gift shop. I don't work for WICMA, but I will say it has a very sexy texture. I was particularly rapt with the photos of Unger's sculptures alongside the artist herself, representations that capture moments somewhere at the crossroads of the beautiful and the banal. I was drawn to their simultaneous simplicity and depth. Something as simple as Unger tending to her sculptures, cradling one and observing the others, perhaps thinking of how to arrange them, felt both ordinary and seductive. Who was this woman? Who was the man behind the camera? What was going on in the photo? What had they done before, and what would they do after? I wanted to know. Sometimes the sculptures are on the sidelines, as if supporting characters in a visual narrative. At other times, they're foregrounded, as the artist immerses herself in their production or installation. And sometimes, Unger and her sculptures are both focal points, equally commanding of our attention. as if protagonists in a dialogue, bodies engaging in stillness and motion before the camera's lens. What strikes me is that these are all at once portraits of Unger, portraits of her work, portraits of Unger at work, portraits of Unger's life, and portraits of Unger and Biddle's life together. In a photo titled Mary Ann with her piece, The Well, Biddle captures Unger on what seems to be a day in early fall as she reposes on a field of grass, wearing wide-legged jeans, her hair in a ponytail, with an as-yet unlit cigarette in hand. Directly behind her, we see the large and bulbous forms that constitute her recent creation, a prime instance of what the artist referred to as anthropomorphic abstraction. Biddle captures a moment where Unger's own body is in conversation with the bodily forms in her sculpture. And yet, one is robust, inanimate, permanent. The other, organic, mortal, impermanent. This question of permanence and impermanence has come up a lot today. Even Unger's cigarette, we know, will eventually burn out, leaving only a vestige of its existence. Biddle captures Unger in that particular instant. She's just about to strike a match and light her cigarette, an instantaneous gesture that will echo the camera's flash. The cigarette is already between her index and middle fingers, already oriented toward the artist's mouth. Within a fraction of a second, the cigarette will be lit, it will be burning, and inevitably, it will be burning out, expiring. The flame will turn into heat, which in turn will transform the cigarette's tobacco and its paper shell into smoke and ash. Its materiality will change, and so will the space it occupies. A contained object between Unger's fingers, now in gas form, will penetrate the artist's body. Its smoke will also follow the currents of the air, coming into contact not only with Unger, but also with her sculpture in the background. Biddle's photograph frames three subjects with different lifespans. The cigarette in the foreground has a very short lifespan. It will have vanished by the time Unger and Biddle leave the site. The sculpture in the background has a much longer lifespan. It will stand indefinitely, conceivably forever, under the care of committed conservators. Finally, sandwiched between the two is Unger, a woman subject to the span of human life, one like all living creatures at the whims of nature, illness, and death. The triangulation of woman, sculpture, and cigarette captures the tension between permanence and impermanence, a central theme today, a central theme in Unger's work. The photo raises questions about temporality and irreversibility, about duration and disappearance. But it also tells a story about pleasure. We can almost feel Unger's enjoyment, knowing she's earned herself a smoke. She may be blinking here, but I like to imagine she's closed her eyes to bask in her pride. I can't help but think of the way people light their cigarettes during or after moments of intimacy. Here it appears that she's intimate with her sculpture, with her own creation. The well, a source of life-sustaining water, at the risk of sounding cheesy, seems to give her peace and tranquility. She's also like a reclining figure of the modern age. So thinking about this position that she's lying in, I think of all these historical women in paintings, but she's reclining, but crucially, she's not nude. We know Unger was a member of the largely anonymous, at the time, Guerrilla Girls, a radical group of artist activists who challenged sexist and racist exclusions in the art world. In one of my favorite examples, this screen print, they ask, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Taken exactly a decade earlier, Unger's pose in Biddle's photograph reverberates with an aspirational, hell no. She can do anything. She can do it in her clothes, and she can do it with a cigarette in hand. Biddle wrote in a forthcoming memoir that he had idealized Unger as an artist who lived in a world of her own creation, where she risked and conquered everything. I love that. She risked and conquered everything. This ethos, I think, really resonates with the speakers in today's symposium. I'd like to offer a brief response to the speakers and to raise some open questions. So I'll begin with Allison. I'm just going to stay on this image for a while. I'll begin with Allison's introduction. Thank you for that, Allison Kaufman. Allison spoke about many things, but one thing that really struck me is the way that she emphasized that Unger sculptures weren't affixed to the wall. They weren't fastened, the elements of the sculptures weren't fastened to each other. Instead, they carry, they hold, they support each other. And this for me is fascinating not only formally, but also conceptually. And as Allison was speaking, I thought, why not use Unger's sculpture, her sculptural elements, as a model for rethinking and reshaping sustainable structures in, for instance, the art world and academia. Structures where we carry, where we hold, where we support each other. I really like this idea. Next, we heard from Horace Ballard. Thank you, Horace, as well. Horace described exhibitions as invitations. I also really, really like this a lot. This exhibition that you've curated, this symposium that has been organized today, they're invitations to think about Mary Ann Unger's work alongside historical and contemporary artists. By extension, they're invitations to think about artists from across time periods working together. And I think that thinking about these artists who may never have met, but their works are in dialogue, to think about them as engaging in cross-generational collaborations would be a really interesting idea and would create the possibility for the lifespan of artists, their practices, and their works to become infinite. In the panel moderated by Horace, we heard from Molly Epstein and Lee Arnold. And this question of permanence and permanence that I discussed that keeps coming up in the Q&A also came up. The two of them touched on it. And they talked about how important this question of permanence and permanence is in the context of sculpture, especially with respect to public art and land art. They raised questions like, what is intended to be permanent in the first place? Whose work is intended to be permanent? Which works indeed stay permanent? Which works end up being removed? What's considered worth protecting and conserving? And last but not least, who decides what's permanent and what's impermanent? These questions will certainly stay with me as I keep thinking about today's talks. It also has me thinking not only about physical, concrete works and their permanence or impermanence, but it also the fact that permanence and impermanence relates to artists' legacies in the context of the art historical canon and the public imagination. So again, we have these questions of who's remembered and who's forgotten. They come up a lot these days. They seem maybe obvious, but I think they're worth asking again and seeing if and how the answer is changing. And of course, as Molly mentioned, these relate also to exhibitions, to publications, and other avenues of production and circulation. In panel 2, Materiality in Public Art, we heard from Eve Biddle. And Eve, I would say that your talk is like a manifesto about failure. I loved it. Eve asked the question, what is a paradigm of success that we can live with? And she stressed the importance of failure. Failure as a space of risk, of learning, of experimentation, of growth, and ultimately failure as something that is absolutely necessary when it comes to success. Lisa Iglesias also spoke. She really focused very directly on materials and materiality, asking questions also related to permanence and impermanence, like longevity and what the lifetime is of a sculpture. What happens to a material after its life in a certain work of art or in the hands of a specific artist? How does it gain a new life when it moves, when it changes sites, when it begins belonging to someone else? I have another set of questions. Materials, you asked what kind of charge do they have? I would add, how do materials in their own right carry meaning and memory? And how are those meanings and memories sometimes retained when even when certain histories seem to be forgotten, which I think relates directly to Heather Hart's work as well in both her keynote and her talk today. So I'll conclude with a slightly longer, but still very brief, I promise, response to Heather Hart's brilliant keynote. I was struck by Heather's discussion about thinking and working somewhere on the spectrum between reality and fiction, between truth and fantasy. Heather framed the space of fiction and fantasy as a creative and empowering space where we can take command of reality, where we can picture the breadth of possibility. Heather said, and I quote, I love this, "My job is literally to fantasize. My job is literally to fantasize." This is a striking provocation and a statement that I think applies to us all. As artists, scholars, curators, activists, as makers, thinkers, writers, and viewers of art, our challenge and our role is to fantasize about the future and the way the world could be. Fantasizing, imagining, envisioning, then, is not aimless. It's not a game. It's not a form of self-indulgent pleasure, though that can be true. It's a crucial step in transforming the world. So I want to thank all our speakers today, and I want to thank everyone who attended today for being part of this space of fantasy and for envisioning a better future for art and more broadly. Thank you so, so much.